1977, that is when Cameron and Janice Hooker kidnapped Colleen Stan, and she was held captive against her will for 7 years, during which time she was treated like a slave, abuse and torture, being held in confined spaces, etc. Hello! There are 2 books that are about the same true crime event. One of them is by the attorney who represented the state when the case went to trial. It is also co-written by a professional writer who attended the trial. The other book is written by the victim, along with a man who, presumably a writer, who interviewed her and helped the book come to fruition. Before we get into the story too much, I do just want to acknowledge that, fingers crossed, this will be the last video that is filmed in this space. I've been working on creating a different space to record in, where hopefully the sound will be a little bit better, less echoey. But moving on to the books. Before we get into the differences in the books, I want to give you a very basic overview of the crime that took place here. In May of 1977, Colleen wanted to hitchhike to go visit a friend for her birthday. When she did that, you can take a guess whose car she got into. She got into Cameron and Janice's car. Janice had a small baby with her, and so when Colleen saw Janice with the baby in the car, it made her feel like that would be a safe choice to go hitchhike with them. At one point, they stop at a gas station. Colleen goes to use the restroom, and at this point, according to Colleen, she felt a very strong impulse. She felt that there was a voice in her head telling her to jump out of the window, run away, and don't look back. However, at that point, she really had no justification for feeling that way, so she decided to ignore her gut instinct, the voice in her head, whatever you want to call it. Goes back to the car. She notices at that time that there is a box in the back seat that was not there before, but just chooses to ignore it. Drive along for a little ways, makes up some excuse. They end up pulling over off the road, at which point Janice and the baby get out of the car, and that is when Cameron Hooker strikes. And he attacks her, holds a knife to her throat. He ends up tying her wrists together behind her back. He ties her ankles. He puts some type of strap around her head that wouldn't allow her jaw to open, so she couldn't yell or scream or make much noise. And then the box that was in the back seat all of a sudden was placed on her head. It was a homemade wooden box that had a hole cut out to fit around her neck. This box that was insulated with carpet to help soundproof it more. In this weird contraption, completely bound, she's forced to lay down in the back seat. He covers her with a towel, a blanket, whatever. They go home, and then it is nightfall, and Cameron ends up taking her down to the basement. That is how she became kidnapped in the first place. Now, what was the point? What purpose did it serve? Well, this is where it gets a little bit into Cameron and Janice's relationship. One could argue that Janice was a victim as well. She met him when she was a teenager. They got married young. She wanted to marry him. In fact, she actually lied and said she was pregnant when she wasn't, to kind of coax him to propose because she wanted to be with him. She thought she wanted to be with him. However, the thing about their relationship is that Cameron was really into bondage. He liked to take her to the woods and string her up by her wrists, and he liked to whip her and do all sorts of things like that. She was not a big fan of that. However, he was very kind and attentive and gentle and sweet with her afterwards. And so she convinced herself to go along with this because she really liked the way he treated her afterwards. And so they get married, and she really wants a baby. She obviously had faked being pregnant previously, but she really did want to have his child. And so he told her that if she got to have somebody, he got to have somebody. And he specifically wanted someone who couldn't say no. And I do believe that that's actually a quote from him, that he wanted a woman who couldn't say no. And he wanted to be able to do all the extreme things that he wanted to do with Janice, but that was hard for Janice, or she didn't want to do, and it was just too extreme for her. And so he wanted to be able to have someone in his house that he could do those things to. So she agreed. His wife agreed to the situation. Obviously, When Colleen saw them in the car, Janice had her baby, and so it was time for him to get his end of the deal, to be held up. Or her end of the deal? You know what I mean. Anyway, well, here's the thing. You think of it as being obviously bondage and kinks and all of that. It is very much related to spicy time, right? However, Janice, she agreed to let him have a woman, a slave, but she did not want him to actually be intimate with them. I have a hard time believing that, like, deep down, she really believed that line wouldn't be crossed, or that Cameron ever believed it. The idea that you're going to kidnap a woman and have her in your house to do all of these very sexually charged things, and that it would never lead to them actually engaging in that seems, I just don't believe she was that naive. If she did believe it at all, it was due to a deep-seated denial. So for Colleen, she spends these first, 7 months or whatever being tortured like this. She is blindfolded the entire time. She is kept in confined spaces outside of just the head box. He ends up, he's handy. Mr. Cameron Hooker is handy. He builds another box to keep her in, just in case someone were to come over, that there wouldn't just be a naked woman in their basement. He keeps her in a small confined space under their stairs. And at that point, that is when it goes from just using her body for gratification to actually forcing her to do labor, to crochet and macrame items. And they also force her to shell nuts, just like big bags of nuts. She would shell them and they would sell those things at the flea market. So they're actually making money off of her labor. So this poor woman being blindfolded, being forced to use a bedpan. She's allowed to come out of the box like once a day just to eat one meal, empty her bedpan. And at that point, obviously just when he wants to use her, then she can come out of her box. He has a lot of magazines that contain bondage kink stuff in it. And he comes across something that's called a slave contract. He's not good at reading, so he asks Janice to type out this slave contract. They end up creating 2 physical copies, one of a slave contract, and the other one is an article about an organization called The Company. Now, The Company is going to be absolutely pivotal to this story. The Company is very, very important. The Company is not real. But the thing about that is that Colleen does not know that. This news article talks about The Company being this organization that allows people to have human slaves, basically, and that they will enforce the rights of those people to keep their slaves. If a slave were to run away, then the company would track them down. They would eliminate anyone who tried to give them assistance. The company is represented as being very powerful, that they can wiretap phones. So don't even bother trying to call someone. The company will know. They will torture you, like the worst types of torture that you can imagine. Like all of these things, like they will track down your family. Just every threat that you can think of that might terrify you into not acting. Cameron Hooker, outside of this article, consistently throughout the years threatened her with the company. She's given this news article to read. Now, I know that, and this was an argument that was made in the trial later on, no reasonable person would believe this was real. The thing is, though, you have to take into consideration that at this point, this woman has been blindfolded and tortured. Like, imagine being blindfolded for 7 months, 7 or 8 months, like seeing no light for that long, except for like what you can see underneath your blindfold. Just that alone, on top of the torture, on top of the isolation, the dehumanization of having to use a bedpan when someone allows you to, being kept in confined spaces. She was very vulnerable to manipulation. And so when they show her this news article, she's overwhelmed and confused, and she believes it. She believes what she's reading. And so she's given this slave contract, and she's told, if you don't sign it, I'm going to sign it for you, and you're going to wish you did. So she does. She signs it, and she truly believes in that moment that she is like signing her life away, basically. That she's agreeing to live as this man's slave and to follow the instructions, which is like, you have to call him master. You're not allowed to wear underwear. Like, just all these things. And she, in her state of mind at that time, truly believed that the company was a threat to herself and her family. This kind of starts a new phase of her kidnapping with this family. I can't get into too many specifics about it because it's a lot. There's a lot of information because 7 years is a long time. Eventually, Janice Hooker had a second child. She was sometimes treated like a babysitter. She was allowed a lot of time outside of her box, and she would watch over both children. They ended up moving to a trailer. When they did that, Cameron built his most nefarious box to date. Janice and Cameron had a waterbed. He built a box that existed underneath it as the support. That was where Colleen stayed a lot of the time for many years. At one point, there was 3 years, she said, that she was kept in this box up to 23 hours a day, sometimes in darkness by herself, just until they were ready to pull her out for something. There was times where she spent more time out of the box, increasing amounts of freedom, but she believed at this time that if she tried to tell anyone, that the company was going to, there would be retribution? No, something bad would happen if she, tried to tell anyone. Cameron would constantly tell her, he would reinforce the idea of the company throughout the years by telling her different people were members of the company, or he would show her little certificates or little cards with the company logo. He was very committed to this bit of making her believe in the threat of the company. So even when he gave her little bits of freedom, where she was allowed to go jogging by herself, or at one point she had a job. She had a job that she went to. She had to give her entire paycheck to them. They let her keep $20 of it, but she had to give all of her money to them, and none of the other stuff really changed. She still would be hung up or whipped or stretched or whatever. It's hard to imagine, right? It's hard for people who have not been through that sort of experience to imagine having an opportunity to get away and not taking it. But I think it's not that hard to imagine just being terrified all the time and just being so scared that if you make the wrong move, you're going to make things even worse. And feeling okay, if she can just be a really good slave, if she can be really, really good and follow instructions, it'll be more of the same, which is bad, but it won't get any worse for her and it won't get the company involved. Now, there's a lot of subplots here where, Cameron had fantasies of owning more slaves. He wanted to kind of create a storage space in his backyard where he'd be able to keep several. That plan never came to fruition. Things started to change between Colleen and Janice after a while. There had been a lot of issues there because eventually, of course, he did start to SA her. And so Janice started to experience a lot of jealousy on top of the already complex feelings that she was feeling towards Colleen, of just guilt and whatnot. And then on top of that, when Colleen started watching the children, apparently there was at least one incident. I wasn't really clear if it happened in one isolated incident or multiple times, where the children referred to Colleen as mom. And that really triggered Janice and really made their relationship the worst it had ever been. However, eventually, Janice started to turn to religion, and Colleen, being increasingly religious throughout this experience, they started to bond over that. Cameron started to kind of use that as a device for himself about, oh, look at this passage about how important it is for wives and slaves to be obedient. And so he was just constantly looking for ways to manipulate people and get them to do what he wanted. He didn't really care what devices he had to use to accomplish that. So if it was the threat of the company, it would be the threat of the company. If it was the Bible, he would use that. It didn't really matter. He just wanted people to do what he wanted them to do. Janice was the one who actually ultimately went to the police. But before she did that, she went to Colleen and she told her that Cameron was not a member of the company. When Colleen realized that the threat of the company wasn't real, she immediately started taking steps to go home. I think she literally left the next day. Both her and Janice chose to leave at that time. Colleen decided to go home to her father. Janice took the kids and went to her parents. In summary, what happened to Colleen while she was in captivity? She was tortured. She was hung by her wrists from the ceiling with all of her weight on her wrists. She was whipped. She was like laid down on this cross thing, and her, like one of those medieval things where they like stretch your limbs. He had one of those things he built. She had like little electroshock things taped to her, and she was shocked, assayed repeatedly, every way that you can be. She was dunked into water and almost drowned. There was so many different things that happened over the course of those 7 years. When Colleen signed the slave contract, she took on a new name and went by the letter K. Cameron Hooker was a big fan of the movie The Story of O, if you're familiar with that at all. A lot of the things that he did with Colleen were inspired by that movie because he was a big fan of it. It was right up his alley. Big difference being that in The Story of O, the woman it was consensual, that the woman was agreeing to the experiences that she was going through. Colleen most certainly was not, on top of the fact that she was consistently forced to live and exist in extremely confined spaces, devoid of light and human companionship for long, extended periods of time. On top of the fact that she was consistently reinforced the idea of the threat of the company, and she would be told horror stories of what had happened to other slaves who had tried to escape. She was forced to wear a collar, a slave collar. Her labia was pierced as some sort of makeshift wedding ring or something. However, also during this time, she was able to, at 2 separate points, she had 2 different jobs, and she was able to leave, go to work, and come back. She was allowed to garden outside. She liked doing that. She liked gardening, and she liked the children. Those were 2 of the bright spots of her life during the times in which she had access to those things. She was allowed to jog by herself. There was 2 separate occasions, I believe, where she went with Janice out to the bars and spoke to other men. At one point, she was told she could call her family. She had not spoken to her family in 3 years. He was listening, making sure she didn't tell them too much or whatever. She was allowed to go visit her family, and he went with her. He did not come in when he dropped her off. However, when he went to pick her up, he did go into the house. He introduced himself as her fiance, saying that they were, going to be getting married, and he made up this whole story of who he was and what his, a fake name and stuff like that. When she left and she went home, her family, they had thought that she had, gotten caught up with a cult or something. Her behavior was so strange, and just the extended periods of time without hearing from her, they were afraid when they did see her, when they did talk to her, to push her too hard, that it would force her to stay away even longer. So they had no idea what she had been enduring during this whole time. But she comes home, and she does not go to the police. Janice asked her not to go to the police because she wanted to give Cameron the opportunity to change. During this time, there were phone calls between Colleen and the Hookers, going both ways. There were times where Colleen called them. Janice becomes concerned because Cameron is not changing, and so she becomes afraid that he will either capture a new slave now that his is gone, or that someday he might possibly hurt their daughters. So she ends up going to the police. So at this point, this is where things start to get into the actual trial. There's a lot of evidence to support the things that Colleen went through. You can see the boxes and the devices that were used against her. You can see some of the scars on her body from the burns. However, you also have a lot of these other pieces of evidence of she had a job. She was out jogging by herself. Look at the phone. She chose to call him afterwards. This is just a lover spat. It got really weird. Conveniently, the statute of limitations for kidnapping had passed. Cameron Hooker could admit to kidnapping Colleen and not have that be something he was charged for. They basically tried to make the argument that she was kidnapped, but everything after that she consented to. That she chose to stay after being kidnapped, and that at times where in writing she told Cameron she loved him and said a lot of things. Now they tried to make the case that, well, look, she was a willing participant in this relationship, this love triangle. She was basically a live-in babysitter / housekeeper for them, versus her being well, no, I just told him that because I wanted him to treat me well. I was trying to survive. I wrote and did a lot of, he told me to write things to him. So I wrote things that I thought he would want to hear. Like, in the end, he was found guilty of 10 different felony counts. So in the end, he ended up going to prison. Oh, and also his wife Janice, because she was the one who reported him and they needed her testimony, she was given immunity. There we go. Now getting into the two distinct books. I read Perfect Victim. This is written by the DA who was representing the state against Cameron Hooker. Her name is Christine McGuire. It was written by her and also a woman named Carla Norton, who is a writer and an editor. She also sat in at the trial. I read this first. When I read this, I actually did not know that the other book existed. I feel, just looking at it as an isolated experience, it's very well done in terms of there's a lot of information, but it never comes across like you're just listing facts. I think that it seems very well balanced between these two authors of having all the sorts of information and details that an attorney would have access to, but it is written more eloquently and in more of a storied type rhythm and method, presumably the writer's contribution. You're getting a lot of information not just about Colleen's background, but also about Janice and Cameron. I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the book itself. I saw that there were some people on Goodreads who were complaining that they felt annoyed that there were little details in the book about the attorney, about the DA. There would be mentions of the fact that she was going through a divorce, during the trial and stuff like that. Honestly, like, it's not really, when you're reading it, you don't really care about that stuff, but I did not find it to be that upsetting. It's not really, her personal life stuff is only mentioned a few times, kind of in passing. It does not take up a lot of time in the book. So even though I would agree that I don't really care, it's not like a big thing that's like overwhelmingly intrusive on the story of the trial and crime and whatnot. So I didn't think that was a big deal. One thing that she talks about in the book that I thought was insane is the fact that they were almost forced to offer Cameron Hooker a plea deal, not because they thought he deserved one, but because the county did not really have funds for the trial, that it was going to be expensive. In the end, it was ruled that would be unethical to offer a plea deal for those reasons, which a lot more went into that decision. But I still just, the fact that was even on the table is insane to me. It also mentions the fact that Janice makes claims against Cameron, alleging a woman he kidnapped prior to Colleen that he actually allegedly killed. They were not able to find the body, and so because of that, they did not have enough evidence to charge him with that crime, even though that woman is missing. Something else they talked about in this book is that the attorney really, really did not want to take the approach that Colleen had been brainwashed. The terms that we have nowadays were less popular at the time. The term Stockholm Syndrome existed, but the psychology behind this stuff was less well known. Well, she thought that if she tried to make the argument that Colleen was brainwashed, that would lose the case. She did end up leaning, based off of the book, heavily on the psychologist that took the stand as her witness. He really was able to lay out the psychology behind why Colleen acted the way she did, even though it doesn't make sense to someone who has not been through those circumstances. It also made me very sad. You really did get the sense that Colleen was the one on trial and not Cameron. Like, so much of the trial was spent trying to figure out why she didn't leave. And the attorney, Christine, was very concerned about her wardrobe. She insinuated that she was dressed in a promiscuous way. She referred to her as having a slinky dress and heels on. Colleen's version of that outfit is very different. It definitely portrays things in a specific light. And so when I finished reading this book and then I discovered that there was another book, I was very intrigued. Our next book, Colleen Stan, The Simple Gifts of Life, dubbed by the media The Girl in the Box and The Sex Slave. Now, this was being co-written by Jim B. Green. I have not seen any evidence that he has ever written anything else, ever. And presumably he interviewed her and then wrote the book. before we get into this, I have to acknowledge, just aside from messaging, aside from anything else, this is not like the first book is the better book. It is a more professional, well-established, well done, well executed book. This book is riddled with spelling errors and grammar errors. I don't know if this man tried to edit the book as well. Whoever did edit it just did a poor job, unfortunately. The cover is not, I do not find it particularly enticing. It's just not the type of cover that gives the vibe of what the book is, I don't feel like. Again, nothing against the content of the actual book itself, but just like the execution of how it was done was just not great, unfortunately. That being said though, I think, with her book, you are going through the same things, but she is omitting the backgrounds and the perspectives of these other characters, focusing primarily on herself. You get more into her familial background, the things that happened to her before this even happened. She had a very difficult life. She went through some difficult things before and after this incident. Her life has certainly not been easy. Something I thought was especially poignant was when she was 14 years old, she was living with her mother. Her parents were divorced. Her mother was dating a man who at one point kissed her, and she was wearing like a tube top, and he pulled her top down or something. When this incident happened, she locked herself in her room, and when she told her mom about what happened, her mother became upset, asking her what she did and demanding that she apologize to this man. Now, this 14-year-old girl, when this happened, left that night to go live with her father. I thought that was poignant because it shows a girl who is not hesitant to remove herself from a bad situation when she sees it. You see that this is someone who is not inclined, under normal circumstances, to stick around when she's being mistreated. I think something else that was interesting that you don't get from the first book is when she's talking about her experiences being tied down to the table in particular, where she has the head box on, she's blindfolded, has the head box on, and she's naked. But she talked about constantly being startled by touch, that because she had this head box on, she never knew when someone was in the room. And so she would find out because they touched her. I can imagine just laying there being completely oblivious to anything going on in your surroundings, and how terrifying, like over months and months, like so much time spent never knowing if you were alone in the room or not. Oh my gosh, that's so eerie. And like those sorts of details that she talks about that are missing from the first book, that of course only she would know. That was one of the criticisms that the attorney had of Colleen, is that during the trial when she had to speak on the stand, she was not very emotive, that she didn't think people would believe her story because she was not crying. She wasn't getting angry. She just seemed very matter of fact in the way she spoke. And then you read Colleen's book and she talks about how when you're a slave, you don't have the luxury of being angry. You are trying to survive. And she got so used to suppressing her emotion. If he was beating her with a whip or something and she started crying, that egged him on. He wanted to just do it more. The fact that she was able to endure all of these things for so long, once she has surpassed that victimhood and became a survivor, that she has actually been able to be relatively normal, all things considered, according to her and the people in her life. She stated in her book that's one of the most common questions she gets asked. How can she be so normal after that experience? When you're reading that book too, it's interesting because as you go through the story, they start referring to Cameron different ways throughout the story. So at times she's calling him Cameron, but during her captivity after the slave contract, they refer to him as Master in the book. So she'll say, Master and I did this. Master said this to me. And it's like this, it feels like uncomfortable. Like it's like it has an effect. Like when you're reading this, it gives you an idea of her perspective, that even now reflecting on that time period, that's what he was to her. He was master. And there's times where she calls him sir or just Cameron. It just depends on where they are in the narrative. Her life after the trial, it's a lot. There's enough in this book that if you have already read the first one, that it's worth also reading. Because even though there is certainly a lot of overlap with the trial and whatnot, there's a lot more information in here about her. And then the last thing that I want to say about it, you find out in her book that apparently the day of the sentencing, so after he is sentenced and they're happy because he got, 104 years, whatever, the DA, Christine, with her writer friend, ask Colleen if she wants to go for lunch. Colleen takes one of her advocates with her, at which point Christine and Carla, according to her, told her about the book deal that they apparently already had for Perfect Victim. And they offered her 5% and tried to offer her a contract that she could sign. And she was very hurt by that. And because throughout this whole trial, she was told very explicitly that she could not pursue any sort of book deals or anything like that because it would make her look like she was trying to financially benefit and it would be bad for her trial. And then the day of the sentencing, the lawyer lets her know that, hey, do you want 5% for your story? So it definitely rubbed her the wrong way. She never really was very close with Christine, but that soiled whatever relationship was there. I know people are more aware about true crime these days. It used to be a whole personality to be addicted to true crime podcasts, and these days people seem to be more discerning about what sorts of true crime entertainment is appropriate. I'm sure that there are people who argue that Colleen is the only one who should benefit from this story. I can't say that I agree with that completely. I don't think it's realistic to expect that only a victim would be able to write or participate in a documentary or financially benefit or whatever from something like this. There's always going to be people who are willing and able to do the research. And again, unfortunately, between these two books, the first book is the better book from a literary perspective. From just if you're looking for a book about the trial and this crime and that's what you're curious about, the first book is the better, more well done book. Colleen's book is definitely worth a read though, because it has those little details about her personal experience. It has the heart in it that the first book doesn't have. And so I'm very much of the opinion that I think both of these books should be allowed to exist. What you choose to support is up to you. If you don't want to support the lawyer, then you can just read Colleen's book. That's kind of where I sit on it. So, and as a final thing that I thought was interesting, that I also had absolutely no idea when I started reading these, is that apparently this year, because you have to remember this original kidnapping was in 1977, Cameron Hooker is having another trial, and it was originally scheduled for, I think, March of this year, and it got pushed back to August of this year, 2024. And so at this trial, they are going to be determining if he is still deemed a sexually violent predator. If he is, then he will remain in prison, and if not, then he will be released into a halfway house. Interesting timing that I happened to read this. So one would hope that he would stay in prison, because it's hard to believe that he would not still be a threat to women. So if you're still here, thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. And maybe I'll see you the next time around. Bye. Well, I mean, nowadays we would probably just use the term human trafficking, but at the time they're using the terminology sex,